is Leslie Pelch at the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. And I think I'm going to wait just another minute or two to see if a few more people show up. And then we'll get started. Okay, so as I said, this is Leslie Pelch at the Vermont Center for Geographic Information, and we are going to be doing a webinar today about QGIS, understanding and using attribute data queries and analysis. As you can see, I'm going to start off with my usual slide, which it's possible that all of you have already seen this, but since I don't know that for sure, I'm going to do it real quick. I want to point out that you should be able to open and close your GoToWebinar pane by clicking on the little orange button with an arrow in it. You can make sure if you have any issues with your audio, you should open up your audio pane and change any settings in there that you need to make sure that it works. If you have questions, you can type them into the questions pane, which you can open up by clicking on the little plus sign that's next to the word questions, and you'll see this area where you can type. And those questions will come to me. You don't have to worry about interrupting me since they just come into the little questions thing, and I'll check every so often to see if there are questions in there. I may not answer questions till the end, depending on whether they seem like they need to be answered right away or not. This is being recorded. It'll be posted at our website, and I'll show you that probably at the end, show you where everything gets posted. At this time, it would be great if you could all click on your little orange hand with the green arrow so I can make sure that you can all hear me like I think you can. And if you click on that button right there, then I will know for sure. Great, thank you. Okay, I think that was everything, right? Questions? And and you will get a follow-up email within 24 hours. And actually, I can't remember now. I think the little survey that I asked you to fill out is actually right after you sign out today. You'll get the link to the survey, to just a feedback survey, to let us know how this went for you and if you have any suggestions for things in the future, both improving the webinars and topics for the future as well. If you want to send me any messages about that, I appreciate it. So let's, we're all going to look at my canoe. So I'm just going to go right ahead and open up Quantum. I have version 1.7.4, which is not the most recent version. If you were on one of my previous webinars, I think I mentioned that that's because I had some flakiness with the version number 8. 1.8, which is the most recent, and so I went back to 1.7. So I don't know whether that was just my problem and my computer or whether there was an actual issue with the that version of the software that anybody else needs to worry about. But that's just my explanation for why I'm using this version. So what we're going to talk about today, as you can tell by the title, is attribute data. So if you don't know what attribute data is, I will explain that. And then we'll be talking about queries and analysis, because queries and analysis make use of attribute data. So I think what I'll do is just start and then talk about what it all means. So I'm going to add data, and the first thing to know, if any of you haven't played around with Quantum yet or haven't been to one of these webinars or trainings, is that the buttons all have a little tip, a little description of what they are. So if you just hover your cursor, don't click but just hover, it'll kind of say what it is. So if you can't remember which button or icon does what, you can always just sort of hover over them and check them out. So I'm going to use the Add Vector Layer button to add some data. I ignore all this stuff up here. The default is all fine. I don't know what situation it's not, to be honest, because I've always just left all the source type as default. The data set, we're going to browse to where I know my data is on my C drive, and I'm just going to add the town boundary data. So there's the town boundary data. So for anybody who's not familiar with how GIS data works, my very quick description of how it works is that we have this geographic and geometric aspect of the data, which is what we see. It's, the shapes of the various features, how they fit together, how they relate to each other, and then of course where they are on the Earth, which is reflected down here in the bottom of your screen with the coordinate. As we move around the map, the coordinate changes, and that's what links it all to where it is on the surface of the Earth. But there's a whole other aspect to the data that really is just as important when it comes to GIS data, and we're going to take a look. We're going to take a look at that by right-clicking on our data layer. So again, notice that I'm clicking on the name of the data layer, not the symbology, not any of these other little things over here, not the X, which just turns it off visually, but on the name of the data layer, I'm going to right-click to get this context menu, and then I can choose Open Attribute Table. I will also point out almost everything you can do in the context menu you can do in either a menu or one of the tabs up here. So this button right here is also Open Attribute Table. They do exactly the same thing. So the attribute table is the tabular data. It is literally a table, just like a spreadsheet or an access table. It organizes the information with these columns and then rows. Each row is associated, and you can sort of see that by just looking at it, is associated with a feature in the data. So in this case, it's on this map of the state. Each one of these polygons is associated with one of these rows in this table. Each of the columns represents an attribute. So this is the attribute information or values for each of the features, are what you find in the cells. So the two things probably here that are most obvious are town name. We all can figure out what that is. And the CNTY is county, and this is actually the code that is associated with each county. So if I was to just do a simple left mouse click, single mouse click right up here, left click, and that automatically orders the data by that particular attribute. So it goes 1 3 5. Actually, I don't want that to be full size. And you can see, if you're familiar with any of the counties, I think 3 is Bennington, so you can see these are all in Bennington County. We can also order it by town name if we're looking for a particular town, obviously. Let's see, make sure I don't forget to point out anything. Okay, so so here's 255 features, and there are 255 polygons over here, and the attributes to each of them. The thing about GIS data is that this isn't just some random table that's sitting off somewhere else that we as human beings can associate with this map. This is actually part of the data, and it's dynamically tied to the data. And the easiest way to see that is that if we click all the way to the left of any particular feature. So these are just the automatically assigned numbers within the software. These are not part of the attribute data. If I just click all the way to the left, it highlights one particular row, which, as you can see, also causes a feature on the map to highlight. And if I click around a little bit, you can see that that happens no matter where I click. So any town that I highlight in the attribute table gets highlighted on the map. And I can actually also demonstrate that if I use, and this is an activity we're going to do a little bit more later, but if I just choose a selection tool over here in the upper left corner, and notice when I hover it says select single feature. If I click on the little down arrow, there are a variety of ways to select features. So this is sort of manual feature selection. I'm just going to do select single feature. I can click on any of the towns and open my attribute table back up, and move selection to top is one of the buttons down at the bottom here. If I do that and then go to the top, you can see I've got Averill selected. And then I want to, let's say I want to click on a bunch of towns. So this is the town I live in, Bolton. And I'm going to hold my control key down on my keyboard in order to retain what I've already selected, and then add to that. So I'm selecting all the towns that border on Bolton, and then open my attribute table back up. And once again, do the, come on, just want to show you that it says it. There we go, move selection to top, and there they are. So those are all the towns that border Bolton. And let's say that there was, let's pretend for a moment that there was a little bit more information in this attribute table, because there's a lot of room here. I mean, this particular data layer doesn't have a lot of attributes. It doesn't use a lot of columns, but you actually can have a lot of columns. And we, if anybody participated in the webinar we did last week, where we looked at symbolizing data and the census data that we dipped into a little bit to put population, to use population to create graduated symbology, you may remember that there were a lot of attributes actually in that data. There were a lot of census attributes that have been added to that data. So let's say there was more interesting attributes in here, and we actually wanted to export this. Let's just pretend for a moment that the town clerk and address of the town clerk were listed in here, as they easily could be for each town. One of our options down here, let's just look at all these. So we can unselect things, we can move selection to top, we can invert selection, and then this final one that has the little table picture in it is copy selected rows to clipboard. So what that does, so I've clicked on that and nothing seems to have happened, but what that means is that I can now, oh, and I forgot to practice this beforehand, so I'm not sure I want to do this right now, but what I can do is copy that into either a text document or I think I can copy it directly into an Excel spreadsheet. Pretty sure I've done that before. Just in case it doesn't work, I'm not going to do it now just because we have a lot to cover this time, but if I have time at the end, remind me to try that again, because I would like to show that. So that's a nice, easy way to export the data out of the attribute table. All right, we did that. Okay, maybe before I go on, because my plan is to close this and open up an existing project to do the next set of things. Maybe before I move on, I'll just see if anybody has any questions about this very simple level of looking at the attribute table. So if anybody has any questions, take a moment to type them and send them now. Hopefully this is all pretty straightforward. Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I will go ahead and move on. So this is just to get the basic concept of attribute table connection to the map. We are now going to open up and notice that, okay, so I'll point that out too. So I just created this as a very temporary project from a blank, nothing here project. That I haven't named it or saved it, and now I'm telling the program that I would like to open a different existing project. So first thing it does is say, well, wait a minute, what do you want to do with this one? Do you want to save it? Do you want to discard it? And I actually want to discard it because obviously this isn't a great map that I've been working on for days. So I'm going to say discard, and it's going to let me look. Now it has automatically gone back to where I last looked for projects. Normally you'd have to navigate here, but this is the one I want. And you can see that it sort of dumps the old one, opens up this one, this existing one that I had saved. So what we have here is a project that shows, now normally when I teach this to a live class, I ask people if they can figure out what this is, but I'm not going to ask you that only because I can't hear any of you and I don't want to wait for you to answer. So what this shows is watershed boundaries at a certain level. As you may know, you can define a watershed at different levels. These are called, I think they're called HUC 8, which is why they're WBD 8 VT _ poly. If you take a look at the table of contents. So that's what the blue lines are. Obviously we have town boundaries. You may notice that there are some other layers listed over here that are actually not showing right now. And that's because those layers are set only to show at certain zoom levels, at certain Yeah, certain zoom levels. So we will see those in a minute as we zoom in, but first we're going to explore this map a little bit now that we have learned about how we can interact with attribute data. We're going to learn some more ways to interact with attribute data, actually. So let's highlight that watershed boundary layer, which is the blue lines, and then we are going to change my cursor to an identify tool, which is all the way over here on the left. So it's a little arrow, a white arrow with a little blue box next to it with a lowercase I for identify. And one of the things I don't know that I talked about that much in previous webinars, and I'll mention it now just in case people are not familiar with this interface. The way GIS software interfaces generally work is that all these pretty little icons, when you click on them, either something happens right away or it turns your cursor into a particular type of tool. So if you click on the zoom tool, it allows you to zoom in. If you click on the zoom out, or the zoom to full, it actually makes something happen right away. If we click on the identify tool, identify features tool, it turns my cursor into identify tool. And just also point out that because I highlighted this data layer, it does figure out that that's the data layer I want to identify, because otherwise, if you think about it, there's all these other data layers. It could say, well, do you want towns? What do you want? So because I've highlighted this one, it does understand that I'm interested in that particular data layer. And when I click on one particular feature, which is now highlighted, it gives me the attribute information about that one feature. So this is essentially the row of information that is associated with that one feature in the attribute table. And we can open up the attribute table and see that in just a second. So it's just providing one feature's worth of information, a slightly different format. Now it's vertical instead of horizontal. These would be the names of the attributes right over here, and these are the values for this particular feature. Oh, actually, let me see if I can I open the attribute table? Yeah. So, oh, but it doesn't show as highlighted. I thought it would be. I thought it would show in here as selected, but it doesn't. It's the Richelieu. Okay, so that's just another way to get in to access the data. When you're interacting with your map and you just want to know what is that one feature, you can use the identify tool. And then, as I said, it doesn't know unless I tell it which layer I'm interested in. So let's say I change my mind and decide, well, actually, I want to know what towns, maybe some of the towns that are in that watershed. And then I have just switched to highlight the town's data layer with a single left click on the name. And then when I click on the map, it knows. And notice what it does actually if I click on a border or boundary and it's not sure what I want. It actually lists several different features here. So in the case where it's not sure which one I'm clicking on, it'll give me a bunch. But I have to notice that and actually open them up if I'm interested in seeing all that information, or if there's one in particular I was actually aiming for. Oh, let's see. I have a question. Let me just see if it's... We'll answer that question a little bit later. Okay, I think we're going to zoom in a little bit now. I am going to change the scale, and actually before I do that, let me just point something out. So this was an existing project that I had created in the past, and one of the things that's important about how I created this project is that I not only just brought some data in, changed symbology, I also told the project, which is the information that the software saves about it, I told it what coordinate system this map project is in. And what that means is I'm telling it what coordinate system either all of the data layers already are in, which is the case with this particular project because all of this data came from VCGI and all of our data is in the same coordinate system, or I actually was saying, well, regardless of what the original coordinate system was for this data, I want the project to be measured essentially and pinned to the Earth in a particular coordinate system. So let me just show you where that happens. Up in the Settings menu, Project Properties, one of the tabs at the top, and it's the one that it's on by default, is Coordinate Reference System. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining what this means, but different parts of the world use different coordinate systems to describe where things are on the Earth within that particular area. So we use lat long when we're using our GPS or something like that, but that's actually not an appropriate system to use when you're talking about a smaller area of the Earth like a state. So you can see that there are a lot of different coordinate systems in here. The key is that our coordinate system, which I've just highlighted down at the bottom here, is Vermont State Plane, NAD 83, and the Vermont part tells you it's Vermont State Plane, that it's State Plane. And our particular reference system measures things in meters. So that's just one of the things that's good to know about Vermont GIS data. The data you get from VCGI will all be in Vermont State Plane meters, NAD 83. And it's good to bring any project that you make into that system if you're working with Vermont data, even if the original data doesn't start out that way. There's this little code here, which is handy to know, 32145, if you want to jot that down. That's sort of a generic code. I don't know what EPSG stands for, I apologize, but it's a code that you can use to search for our coordinate system. So if I put 32145 up into this little search box that's in the middle, and then I click Find, you'll see that up here it's Vermont. Let me just, I can show you. I'll click somewhere else just to prove that it will go back there. So it's going to search that up and it's going to use that code. So if you ever need to find it, you could always search for it based on that code. And then the other thing I want to point out is that down at the bottom here, it confirms that if you go down to the bottom right corner, it says EPSG 32145. So that just reassures me that we really are in Vermont State Plane System. The reason I mention all that before my next step is that I'm now going to change the scale of our view, and I'm going to change it to 400,000. And the issue here is that the software can't really accurately compute the scale or measure anything, obviously, if it doesn't know what coordinate system the data is in, because it needs to know what the coordinates that are inherent to the data really mean. In our case, there are numbers and they mean meters. So it can do all the math necessary to figure out what the implications of that are. That we don't have to do that math, but it needs that information in order to do everything accurately. I will admit most of this data comes with a little file that's part of it that actually tells the software what coordinate system and projection it's in, but it's still good to have a general idea that it's an important issue. So we're now at a scale of 1 to 400,000, and you can see there's more data showing up now. We're getting these green polygons, we're getting some green lines, some more blue, or actually these are the same blue lines, these are the watershed boundaries, and also some black dots. Now, and if we look over in the table of contents, you can see the symbology for the various data layers so that we can figure out what all of these things are. The black dots go along with, let me just expand this a little so we can read it, tourism rec sites boating points. So that's a subsection of the rec sites data layer. This is just showing boating access points. There's a layer called cadastral cons pub poly, which is conserved land, publicly conserved land. And then the other squiggly green lines are roads. I'm not sure why I made those green, but they are. All right, so let's use our identify tool to access some of this information. So first thing I did was try to click on that little black dot, but I forgot my own instructions, and I forgot to change the highlighted or selected data layer to the tourism rec sites boating point layer. So now if I click on that point, I can actually open up the attribute data for that one feature, and you can see that this attribute table has a lot of attributes. There's not values for everything in there, and it's sort of got an interesting structure. If you take a look at it for a minute, you can see there's a lot of different, and remember this comes from a bigger data layer that's all kinds of rec sites. So you can see that refers to swimming pools, tennis, volleyball, baseball, camping, all sorts of stuff. And then there's also some contact information in here. There's some information about where this is. It's in Rutland. And whatever I just clicked on is owned by Green Mountain National Forest, I think. That's what that means. Okay. We can also look at some roads. See what the roads data looks like. Notice that we're highlighting a segment of the road. That's how the data thinks of itself. Vermont Route 12, some other information in there. Not all that meaningful to most of us. We've got the towns. Oh, let's look at the cons pub data. So this cons pub data is interesting. The way it has been symbolized here, it looks like, for instance, this big green blob must all be one big green blob. But if we actually click on part of it, you'll see that it's really composed of many smaller polygons. It's just not symbolized that way. So visually it looks nice, but in terms of understanding the actual data and what it shows, you've got to be a little careful with what you assume about things. So you can see that this is part of Green Mountain National Forest, as are most of these blocks over here. But if we move over to some other spots, we have the Les Newell Wildlife Management Area. We have a Scutney State Park, Podunk Wildlife Management Area, Chelsea Town Forest. So there's a lot of different types of conserved land in there, obviously. All right, so that's the Identify tool. Another way that we can interact with the data and get access to that attribute data is what I showed you briefly before, which is the selection tool. And as I showed you, there's a number of different ways to select. Obviously, you can select a single feature, which is pretty similar to using the Identify tool, except that you're actually selecting it and it will be highlighted in the attribute table as well. We can also select using different shapes. I actually find the polygon one pretty useful. So let's say I wanted to figure out which boating sites are kind of in the general vicinity of this area. So I might draw my polygon, and what I'm doing is I'm doing a left click to create a vertex. That's how I'm creating all these different vertices. And when I'm done, I have to do a double click. Oh, maybe not. No, it's not letting me in. All right, maybe I'm going to do a right click. Thought that was a left click. Oh, and look what I did. I wanted to do rec sites, and instead I did cons pub. So let's try that again. Rec sites, and first thing I'm going to do is clear the selection because that's not what I want selected. And we'll try again. And I'm doing a right click in order to finish that. It's a little bit hard for you guys to see probably, but a bunch of those black dots just turned yellow. And so right now, because they're not labeled, I would have to go and click on each one of those to find out what they all are. But instead of that, I can open up the attribute table. I can use the Move Selection to Top button. And so that's the attributes for all of those boating sites that I just selected. And in this case, it would actually make sense potentially for me to export this data, and I would have, for some of them at least, I don't think they all have contact information, but for some of them, they probably all have some kind of contact, one would hope. I'd be able to output that information in a pretty easy format. I could just paste it into a Word document or put it into an Excel spreadsheet and have easy access to it rather than having to click on each one individually to access that information. So the other selection tools work pretty much the same way. You could do a radius. Oh, let's clear that first. So you might say, well, I want to see everything that's within. It doesn't give you a measurement, but you could do a sort of a visual radius. It's a little bit unfortunate that in this particular way of doing it, you aren't setting a radius. You can see we've got a selection of points, and there they are. Okay, I'm going to deselect all that. So those are two ways to access the information that's in the attribute table. Another way that you can use that information in the attribute table is to actually do a search based on values. So you're not necessarily doing it based on what you see on the map. You're not necessarily doing it by scanning through the attribute table, but you might actually just have some values in your head that you can use to search for something in particular. So I'm going to search for a lake. So, all right, water DLG lake underscore poly is a data layer that has surface waters data that is equivalent to what you'd see on a topo map, USGS topo map. So there's lots of features in there. And what I would like to do is find a lake. So let's say I'm not familiar with Vermont and I don't know where this lake is, but I know what it's called. And I want to find Lake Dunmore. So I'm going to type Lake Dunmore down in the search look for box, the search box down at the bottom of the attribute table. Notice that by default case sensitive is turned on. I'm going to turn that off because I don't know for sure whether it's all caps, all lowercase, or capital case, and I don't want that to make my search not work. So the in variable, I'm going to look in here and say, well, what attribute would make sense for where the name of the lake would be? Oh, look, name. And then I just click on the search button. Now, it will appear that nothing has happened, but if we look up at the top, it says one matching feature. So that's how I know that it actually did look and it did find something. And if I move the select, and it doesn't happen to, it's highlighted now, but it doesn't happen to be in my view. So if I move it up to the top, and then and there it is. And if we scroll a little bit, we can find the name. There it is, Lake Dunmore. Okay, so we know we found it. It's in here. It's highlighted. And now we can click on this icon, which is a little magnifying glass that says Zoom Map to Selected Rows. So this is our selected row, obviously. So now I want to zoom the map over there. Oops. And sure enough, there's a highlighted lake, which we believe is Lake Dunmore. Okay, I think I am going to pause here and just see if there are any other questions. Maybe I'll answer Paul's question too. All right, so I'll just pause, and if anybody has questions at this point, feel free to send them. Paul asked, when you close a project, as I did a little while ago, there are save and discard options, but is there a way to save without saving the changes you just made in the most recent session with a map? So if you, I think if that had been, and we can actually test this at the end of this, at the end of the webinar, because this was an existing project, and when I leave it, it is going to ask me not do I want to discard it, but do I want to save the changes that I made to it? And if I say no, then it won't save the changes that I made to it. I think the discard option is just what it says when it's a brand new project that you haven't saved yet. So it's asking you, do you want to just not save this at all, or do you actually want to save this? So those are those two options really are most meaningful when it's brand new. But yes, it will let you open up a project, an existing project, and if you do something stupid and realize you don't really want to save the change you just made, or you're just playing around with it but you want to keep it the way it was originally, you can just not save it when you close it, but the project will still exist in the form that it was before you started because it was an already saved project. All right. Okay, what we're going to do next is actually use this highlighted lake that we have, Lake Dunmore, to do another interesting operation that takes advantage of, well, in this case, we're actually taking advantage of the spatial location of this and the size and all that. We're going to create a buffer, and we're actually going to use the buffer to select features from another data layer. So we are going to start using some tools up at the top. We're going to go into the vector menu. So up at the very top, all the little words are above the icons, the word vector. If we click on that, it opens the vector menu. And we are going to choose geoprocessing tools. And then we're going to choose buffer. I should point out at this point, since some of you may feel that as I go through the rest of this webinar, I'm going to be doing a lot of things that involve opening menus and clicking on stuff. And although this is recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again afterwards, I'm basically following along the training that I do in the summer, and I have a printed out manual that everybody who takes this in the summer gets, and I am going to post that at the webinar archive page right next to the recorded webinar. So you'll not only have the webinar itself if you feel like going back and looking at it or recommending it to someone else, there will also be a posted PDF document that takes you step by step through exactly what we're doing today. I should have told you that at the beginning so you didn't have to take notes if anybody's bothering to. All right, so vector, geoprocessing tools, buffer. So we get this buffer dialog box. Our input data layer, we do not want to be town boundaries. We want it to be DLG Lake Poly, because that's the data layer that this nice highlighted lake is in. Use selected features, right? Segments to approximate, I don't know what that means. I have to admit, that's another thing I've always just left on default. Someday I should figure out what that means. The buffer distance, now this is one of the few downfalls of QGIS in my opinion, is that, and actually, oh, even as I say this, I remember that someone in one of my classes, I think, figured out how to change this. By default, this is going to measure only in the same units that the coordinate system is in. And remember, I mentioned that Vermont State Plane is in meters. So I need to put a number in here that is the number of meters that I want as my buffer distance, which is fine as long as I don't mind meters, but most of us tend to want to do our distances in feet or something else. So it's a little bit annoying that this just isn't offering me a unit option here. I believe there is actually a way to change this in the project properties. But again, I'm not going to spend time on that because I don't have my little cheat sheet on how to do it right in front of me and I don't want to fumble around. So we're just going to use meters. I'm going to set it to 200. I don't think we'll have time at the end to look at that, but if we do, somebody could feel free to remind me if you're interested to figure out how to change the units here. All right, so we're setting it to 200 meters. And this is going to create an output shapefile that we need to save. I have one in here already? No. I'm just going to call it buffer. And notice that it is going into a place that I want it to go. It's not going somewhere random. So make sure you know where you're saving stuff like this. And we'll say OK. So now it says it created it. Would you like to add it? Yes, I would. And then I'll close this. So as you can see, it did indeed add this whole brand new shapefile, which is called buffer. And if we turn it off, you can see, actually maybe what we could do is put it under there. There. So I just changed where it's being drawn. It's now being drawn underneath the DLG lake layer so that we can actually see it and see the highlighted lake over it. So that's our 200 meter buffer. And the reason that we did this is we're actually going to use the buffer to select some other features. In this case, we're going to look for some boating access points. All right, and we're going to go back to the vector menu, and this time we're going to go into Research Tools and select by location. So we're going to be selecting our features not in the town boundaries data layer, but in the rec sites boating point data layer. And we want the features that are in the boating points layer that intersect features in our buffer layer. So again, think through what we're doing here. Created a buffer, and I'm basically asking the question, are there any features in the boating points data layer that are within 200 meters of the edge of Lake Dunmore? I don't need to use selected features only because the whole buffer shapefile is what I want to use. Okay. All right, so all I did was click on OK, and the only thing that changed, you can see it a little bit easier on this one, is that there's at least one feature. This little circle up here was a black circle. Now it's selected. And if we go into the boating points attribute table and move selection to the top, we can see that indeed we've got two features in here. There's some contact information, and the site name is, there we go, let's open that up, Lake Dunmore Campersville and Lake Dunmore Fish and Wildlife Access. So that makes sense. So we found our two boating access sites next to Lake Dunmore. And now let's deselect everything. So right now we have Lake Dunmore selected in one data layer. We've got some rec sites selected in another data layer, and we're just going to deselect everything. Remember that you can deselect just within one data layer by going into the attribute table and just deselecting in there. But since I want it all deselected, I did it out here. Okay, so someone asked if I put a minus sign in front of the buffer value, does, oh, that's a good question. Okay, so Paul asked, when we create the buffer, can we make a buffer go inside the polygon? Oh, I've already deselected this, but I can select it. Hold on. All right. Let me just very quickly see if... so we're going to try to create a buffer that goes inside. Yes, it does. That's a good question. So now that brown thing is a buffer that goes smaller than the polygon, inside the polygon rather than outside. That's a good question. All right, so now the final thing we're going to do is a kind of a long, well, it's not really that long, but a complicated little exercise to show how we can use an attribute query. So we've just obviously been exploring how to just get at the attributes, how we can actually use the attributes to do a little bit of analysis, and both to find things, well, I guess to find things and select things. Now we're going to use the attribute query in order to find something. So we're going to go back to full extent. Lake Champlain 100. So this is the data layer for Lake Champlain over here on the left. Lake Champlain 100 poly is the active layer. So that's the layer we're going to query. We're going to click on the layer menu and choose query way down here in the list. So this is the query builder. So you can see that it's showing us the attributes that are available in the water Lake Champlain 100 polygon layer. Doesn't have very many fields. And I'm going to type in, well, so I'm going to do a combination of things. I could just type down here at the very bottom is where our actual query is going to build up and show. I could just type in here, but as you can imagine, me just typing and having to spell everything correctly and having to do all the right capitalization and everything, has higher potential for mistake. What I can do instead is I can do sort of a combination of just clicking on stuff to stick it in there and then a little bit of typing. So my first thing is I'm going to double click island. So by double clicking that, it makes it show up down here. So you have to double click on fields, and I think on values you single click on operators. So I'm going to be typing island equals, and one of the other things I forgot to do is when I have island highlighted, I'm going to click on the button all over here under values, and that's going to show me what values are available for any feature that has a value for that attribute. What are the values that could be there? So there they are, yes and no. So island equals yes, and so again I'm double clicking up here, single clicking down here, and area island equals yes, and area is greater than, and this is where I'm going to type a number. Sorry. Now I'll warn you that this number is long, and also I might type it wrong, and it was figured out by the person who originally wrote this exercise, this manual, and he just wanted this to use this as an example of how you might search for something. If you're looking for something that's a particular size, in this case we're looking for an island that's a particular size, this is how you would go about figuring that out. There's no reason you would know to type this number except that it's in the manual to do it. 20235,000. Okay. But you can imagine that if you had some other question that you were asking about looking for something that was within a particular size range, this is how you would go about it. So island equals y, and area is greater than this, and area is less than this other number, 2428200. Okay, and that's it. So I can test it, and by testing it I can see whether it works or not. If you get a thing here that says there's nothing, then you know you need to go back and check to make sure you've typed everything in right. So since it worked, I'll go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to open the attribute table. You can see here's my one selected feature, and I'm going to zoom. So actually I should explain what this did was it basically did a definition query, so that now the only feature that's showing up in this attribute table right now is the one that met that query. That's why we're only seeing one thing here. And I actually had to highlight it to get it to be zoomable too, so that we could zoom to the highlighted feature. So there it is. And if any of you are familiar with Lake Champlain and the islands up there, you may be able to figure this out without doing this next step. But I'm now going to change over to the town boundaries layer being the highlighted layer, so that I can do a identify query to find out what this is. In the town boundaries layer, this is Isle La Motte. If it wasn't a town, that wouldn't really work, but this is both an island and a town. Okay. Yeah, I do have time to do some of these other things I was thinking about. All right, let me see if... okay. Can you buffer a line rather than a polygon? Yes, I believe you can. I'm just looking at the questions again. So I encourage everyone, if you have questions at this point, send them in. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover. I can talk about metadata, and we could look at some metadata. But I think maybe for today at least there's more value in just sticking with QGIS and looking at QGIS. So please do send your questions. Paul sent another question here that I'm going to go ahead and answer. Can you buffer a line, just a line, rather than a whole polygon? I believe you can, so let me just test that. I'm going to clear clear everything here and zoom back out a little bit. And my blue hand is my pan tool. All right, so there's a line. First, I'm going to select a line segment. Oh, that's a town. Where are the roads? Actually. All right, so there's a line segment. Let's go up to Vector Geoprocessing Buffer. We don't want town boundaries. We want roads. Only selected features. Let's say 100 meters. There you go. Oops. So there you go. There's a buffer that was created from a road. 100 meters on either side. Oh, that's something else we could do just briefly is measure. And I could put this under the roads. Oh, and of course I've got this in feet. Maybe that was the thing that I was able to change. That someone figured out for me. It was the measurement tool, not the buffer. So 300 feet, that makes sense. About 100 meters, 326. Oops. Go away. There we go. I was going to check whether in the project properties box. Okay, layer units. Oh, that's interesting. So in the general tab of the project properties box, we can change the layer units, but it does say use only when CRS transformation is disabled, which I think this is talking about this on-the-fly CRS transformation, which allows me to bring in data that isn't in the same coordinate system, but it will be transformed into the matching coordinate system so that everything can line up. So in this particular project, I could do that because I'm not bringing in any outside data that's not Vermont State Plain, so I don't need to have this turned on. But that's something you'd want to be careful about because if you had New Hampshire data that you wanted to bring in, you would want that on-the-fly thing to be turned on. So I could layer units. I'm just curious how my buffer might work out now. So I'm going to redo my buffer and just see whether this changes anything. Nope, that didn't change anything. So it doesn't change the buffer units. I'm not sure what that does change. Ah. Oh, that's weird. Oh, now it's reading this incorrectly, I think. It's reading this whole width as 200 feet. Okay, I think what I just did really kind of messed this up. I actually told it that the units are different, and they're not. I'm going to go back to meters. Okay, let's see if there's any more questions. Getting to the end of our time. Can you buffer just one side of a line? No, I don't think you can do that. At least I did not see that. hopefully all the rest of you are interested in buffering, or if you don't have any other questions, I guess. Segments, so maybe that's where you'd want to, I don't think that's what these segments to approximate refers to. Dissolve buffer results. Yeah, I don't see anything in here that's going to let me pick one side or the other. Unless you want to learn more about segments to approximate. If that turns out to be, then I suppose that's possible, but I don't think so. No. So no, I would say the answer is no. I think you have to buffer both sides of whatever it is you pick. Well, if it's a line. Okay. Okay. Well, maybe I'll just briefly talk about metadata since I do have a couple of minutes here. So, all right. So we've covered a lot about attributes, right? We've looked at attributes. We've opened up some attribute tables. You can see that they all look different. I can open up some of these just to look at them real quick. Got all these different things. One of the things that you'll notice in attribute tables is that often the names of the attributes are cryptic. So HUC2, HUC3, or HUC4, HUC6. If you know watersheds, you might know what those mean, probably. But you might not. They might seem kind of cryptic, esoteric. Remember the town boundaries layer used a code for county, which admittedly we could figure out in our case because we're familiar with the state, but there's nothing here that actually tells us what these counties are other than the number. The rec sites, most of the rec sites ones actually sort of are figure outable. They designed these, I think, so that you could look at the name of the attribute and figure out what they are. But with all of these questions in mind, the fact that we often do have information that's not right there, that's not obvious in terms of understanding the attributes, I want to point out the fact that for Vermont data, and for most data that you get, this should be true, but for any Vermont data that you get from VCGI, you can access what's called metadata. So let's go to the data warehouse. And let's pretend for a second that we had actually gone here to download some data like the 911 data. There's a lot of different 911 data actually, but we're going to look at the eSite data, which is the point data for each address in the state. So that's this row right here that says emergency. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth one down. Emergency E911 underscore eSite, E-S-I-T-E. And this is buildings, hydrants, public. It's a number of different things. It's mostly buildings. We could download it, but before we download it, it's a good idea to look at the More Info page. This gives us a very quick snapshot of what this data is, who to contact if we have questions about it, how old it is, how recently it was updated, and most importantly for this quick discussion, it gives you access to the full metadata. So the full metadata is going to answer all your questions, hopefully. Each of these words over on the left that's a blue link opens up to more information. So description is a really good thing to look at. It's a normal language abstract about the data. If we scroll down just a little bit, we get to data structure and attribute information. We can look at an overview, it's point data, and then we can actually look at the attributes themselves. So these are just those column headings with any kind of description or code information that we need to know, hopefully, in most cases. Now, a lot of these, again, are sort of not necessarily things we need to know, but I'm going to get down to, oh, this is all new, so I'm not that familiar with it. So house number obviously means address number. Site type. So site type is an important attribute in the 911 data, and this is where we can look at all the different site types there are. So this is also a good way to become familiar with the data before you start using it, so that you know what's in it, what's available for attributes in the E911 data. And you can see there are lots and lots of attributes. Now they've actually changed from a system where they were using codes to represent all this stuff to now the actual value that you'll see in the attribute table is words that you can understand. So the definition and the value is not that different. In the past, it was a little bit more important to get into the metadata to look at what those codes meant. But anytime you come across codes in attribute data, know that you should look back at the metadata to find out what they mean. And the metadata is not automatically attached to the data the way that attribute data is attached to the geographic data. The metadata is usually an HTML file or a text file that you have to access separately, that you just open up. And hopefully it came along with the data. If it didn't, then you go back to the data originator and ask them for it. I want the metadata. If they don't know what metadata is, just say, I need information about the attributes and what they mean, and also how the data was created, how old it is, who I should contact with questions, that kind of stuff. So it's going to be in this format, this consistent format if you get it from us. It may not be from other people, but what matters is the information, obviously. All right, and if there aren't any other questions, I think I'm probably going to say goodbye to everybody. Oh, and I was going to show you where you can find so there is a link right on this front page to webinars scheduled in January, which as long as that link stays there, it's a quick way to get to the events page, which is also you can find by going to the Community Resources tab and Events. And that will take you to this page. Just below the calendar, you'll see Event Archive, and you can see Webinars. And the one that I did last week is here, although I haven't posted the how-to manual part of it yet. I just realized when just before this webinar that I hadn't done that. So I will be adding that there. And this webinar will be posted here within a few days, and there will be 2 links, the recorded webinar as well as the PDF manual that kind of goes along with what we did today. So hopefully that is helpful to everybody and went over a little bit. And I'm going to say hope you all have a great day and hope this was helpful. Thanks.